Hello and welcome to this part of the Intro to ESS series. I'm going to give you a very quick tour of Org Mode, some of the facilities in Org Mode. There's a slide deck and you're invited to look at the slide deck. There's some a .org file you're invited to play with inside of Emacs after looking at this and sort of explore. But right now we're going to dive into an actual real live .org file and see what we might do in it. So I'm running Emacs -Q, which means that it's coming up without any of my customizations. So we need to enable the execution of our code inside of Org Mode, and so we'll do that with this. This is a source code block, which is where source code lives inside of Org Mode, and it's an eLisp source code block, as we see here. And so I'm going to execute it, and it's going to execute org babel do load languages. Normally you'd customize org babel load languages, but when you're doing it in a live session, this is how you do it. And also for the same reason, we want to be able to edit our code. And so again, because I don't have my customizations running, I need to do this code. Okay, so now let's go write some code. So to start, we need to get a code block, a source code block. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say Control-C, Control, comma, S, and then that sort of gives us an outline of a source block, and we're going to say R because it's going to run R. Then I'm going to hit return, then I'm going to type ABD just to have something to type, and I'm going to set it equal to sign of 42. And then I'm going to evaluate this code block just like we evaluated the eLisp blocks. I'm going to type Control-C twice. And each time, Org Mode is going to come up and ask me if I'm sure that I want to evaluate this source code block. Obviously, evaluating a source code block, random source code blocks and random files can be a big security concern. So Org Mode is going to check with me about that. And so down at the bottom of the screen, if you can see it, it says, do I want to evaluate this R code block in your system, yes or no? And I'll type yes. And down here, we see the results, the sign of 42. So then what about if we wanted to use the same code, say it was a utility function or something like that, we wanted to use it in a different source block. Let's go down and build a different source block. Control-C, Control, comma, S, and then again the letter R. And then what we will do to copy the code is we'll use a facility in Org Mode called NoWeb, which is sort of a literate programming term. It's kind of like a pound include. Let's see, in order to do this, I need to have a name for the source block that I want to copy the code from. So I'll come back up here, and I will add a name. I'll say pound plus name colon sign 42 to give it something that we can remember. And so in this code block, I'm going to use two angle brackets, and I'm going to say sign 42 and two more angle brackets. I'll say 42, 42, and two more angle brackets. This NoWeb inclusion feature is disabled by default because people might be using angle brackets for some other purpose. And so we need to go and we need to add a so-called header argument on this begin source line. We're going to add the NoWeb header argument, and we're going to set it to a value of yes. Okay? And so let's see. So we have this, and let's do something with this, this thing. We'll do exp of ABD. Okay? And so we'll do Control-C twice again to evaluate it. And we will look at it. We'll say yes. And we get the results, 0.399. Now let's say that we were sort of curious to look at what was going on. We wanted to sort of examine ABD, which is a variable that presumably is in the global namespace. Normally, when you evaluate in Org Mode a source block, it instantiates a brand new process, runs the source code, collects the results, and then disposes of that process. But a lot of times, like when you're exploring a new data set or you're debugging, you may want to sort of keep the process, the R process in this case, around for a longer period of time. And so we can use the :session keyword, and we just name a session. It can be named anything, R session I'll call it here. And what that tells Org Mode is, okay, please evaluate this code in a process, an inferior process. In this case, it's R, so it'll be an inferior ESS process, and keep that process around for a while. And so we'll notice that when I'm about to evaluate it using Control-C twice, and so first it asks me down here if I'm allowed to evaluate it, and I say yes. And then, since it's starting a new process, it wants to know what directory to start it in. And it proposes the current working directory, which is fine with me, so I'm just going to hit return. But you could change the directory if you wanted to. Very quickly, it flashed something on the screen, and so we will go and look at that. But it evaluated it, and the results didn't change, so we didn't see anything change. So let's split the screen. Let's go to this other side, and let's tell it we want to go look at our session. So here we are in our session. We see that it started a new R session, as if we just typed R from the shell prompt, and then we can say ABD, and we can see ABD, the original sign of 42. So let's go back here, and let's say that we wanted to use the output of this block that we just had. So before we used the code from a previous block, now let's use the output from this block. So let's give it a name, because we're going to need to be able to name it. Name : exped. Okay. And now we'll start a new source block. Control C, comma, S, R. We'll say no web yes. So by the way, this no web parameters and the session parameters, all this stuff, you could actually do on a per file basis, or because the file is sort of structured outline format, on a subtree basis in the file. Here, just per ease, to keep from confusing, I'm doing it on the per source block basis. And what I'm going to use, I can't use no web to include, if I use no web, I'd be including the contents, the source of the exped source block. I want to include the results of it. And so what we do there is we use a variable, a :var, and then we give the name that we want that variable to be inside of our source block, and then an equal sign, and then the name of the source block whose results we want to bind to that variable. So we'll say exped, okay? And let's see, and in here, just for fun, we'll also include sign 42. We don't need to, but we're going to include it because, let's see, I guess just to have something to say, we're going to have this equal to ABD over great. And then we will execute this, Control C twice, say yes. It's asking us a second time. It asked us the first time because it needed to evaluate exped. If I had actually pointed it out, I forgot, I would have pointed out that it was asking if it's okay to execute or evaluate exped. And I said yes. And now it's asking to evaluate the actual source code block that we just wrote. As I'll say yes again, and then we get the results. Okay? So that's a bunch of stuff. Now, sometimes what we've been getting at each of these source code blocks, the results have been essentially the value at the end of the source code block. The last statement in R typically is the value that returns from a block, and a lot of languages are like that. Other languages are different. But sometimes you might want to look at, for example, what the standard output is. So let's do a source code block that does that. So we'll say Control C, Control S, Control comma, then an S, and then R, and then we will say cat, hello world, \n, and now we will evaluate it. Control C, say sure, evaluate it, and we didn't get any results. The reason we didn't get any results is because the default for R is to give the value, the last value of the block that you execute, or the default in org mode. Here, we don't want that. We don't want the default is results value. You can type it, but it's the default. What we want is results output, to say, yeah, what we want for the results are whatever was written to standard out. So let's Control C again, look at it, and we get hello world. Okay, then, looking at my notes, let's edit some code. Now this code is a little bit longer. It came from question mark plot inside of R, and it has some header. It has more header arguments than normal and stuff like that. So I pre-typed it ahead of time. And so the header arguments, it's gonna plot something. And so we say the results are an output file and it's a graphics file. And we give the file name. we say that it exports both. Exports is, a lot of people use org mode as a front end, say, to LaTeX or to building, simple web pages and stuff like that. And so you export to LaTeX or to a PDF file, say, or to an HTML file. And we're going to export all this stuff at the end. And then no web yes. Actually, I don't see why I have no web yes here, but I do. Okay, but let's go and say instead of Control C, we're going to say Control C apostrophe. Now we're in an ESS mode, major mode editor. And we can do stuff we want to do. Like we could say foobar if we had a foobar thing. Now, ESS, the syntax checker, doesn't know anything about no web, and so it considers that to be an error. But again, we can do anything we want to do in an ESS buffer. We can do here, and then when we're done editing our code, we would again type Control C and then apostrophe, and that would embed whatever changes we had back in the org file. And now we will execute this block with Control C twice. We will say yes, and we have some results down here. We can use Control C, Control O to open it, and there, in fact, is our little graph. And then finally, what we'll do is we will export everything. See what we get. It's not going to be very great, but we'll see what we can get to export. We type Control C, Control E, and all of the things that are in red over here are things that you could at this point do. We're going to export it as an HTML file, so we'll say H, little h, and now the red has changed to the sub options, and we'll say O because we're going to export it as an HTML file and open it in our local browser. And it asks, can I execute this? Can I evaluate that? Can I run this? And then, bingo, there it is. Now again, it's not particularly great looking, and I have my browser set to night mode or dark mode or whatever it is, but we get everything, including the chart. So that's kind of the hands-on part of the tour. The slide deck has information more about org mode and about Babel, which is the subsystem that we use for programming, about source blocks that you've pretty much looked at. I think we looked at all of the header arguments except the Tangle one. Tangle lets you extract from the org file pieces of code and write them in sort of language-specific files that you define. If you need to compile things or you want to do R scripts and stuff like that, you can do that. What I find is that when I'm doing any sort of a work, I'm flitting between three different buffers. I'm flitting between the actual .org file itself and doing minor edits of source blocks there. And then also an org source edit buffer, I bring them up and bring them down. The Control C apostrophe, where I'm in ESS mode, and then the R session buffer, where I'm also in ESS mode. And that's where I sort of run code, examine state, debug as I need to, and stuff like that. There are a lot of other resources available, among others, some of the other talks in this ESS intro series. The org mode official quick start guide is very, very nicely done, and I highly recommend it. The web page, et cetera, et cetera. The slides that you're looking at right now should be available from wherever you click to look at this video. You should be able to see them. And there's also, as I said, I think at the beginning, a .org file that's linked right here in the slides. So you have to click where you found the video to get to the slides, and then when you get to the slides, you can click on this, presumably whatever your PDF viewer is should allow you to do that. And that's designed for you to sort of go through in Emacs, open it in Emacs, download it, open it in Emacs, and go through and Control C on a lot of different source blocks as long as they don't look dangerous to you, and experiment, try changing things and see what happens and stuff like that. There's some other tutorials that you can look at, some videos, and I want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank all the people that wrote all this amazing code that we get to use and maintain it, and all of the people on email lists that are very helpful in terms of providing help and stuff like that, and some people for helping me with this particular presentation. And I think that's it, and now I'm going to go try and figure out how to stop recording.